Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this short presentation is to introduce you to the preacher Jonathan Edwards and talk a little bit about the Great Awakening in American life. Now, first of all, the Great Awakening had nothing to do with getting everybody to get more sleep. We're really talking about a series of religious revivals, and these started around the 1730s and grew out of a concern that Christians had just become going through the motions, that church didn't mean anything to them anymore, that they went in, they sat down, they stood up when they were supposed to, and that there was no connection anymore. And this was an attempt by a whole series of preachers to bring more emotion to prayer and religion, a little more individuality, and a little bit more of this connection and intimacy. Now, the origins of the Great Awakening are actually over in Great Britain and began with people like the Wesley brothers, who were some of the founders of Methodism, and George Whitefield over in England, and then crossed over as evangelists to the American colonies. And unlike the kind of Puritan sort of spirituality that we'd seen in the United States, in the 1700s, this idea of the Great Spiritual Awakening was an awakening of your emotions and spirituality, with the purpose of feeling a greater sense of intimacy with God and a greater understanding of God's importance in the lives of these folks. Which brings us to Jonathan Edwards, and we're going to talk a little bit about his background. Now, Jonathan Edwards was perhaps the most influential preacher in shaping the Great Awakening. And a couple of interesting facts about him: he's actually the grandfather of Aaron Burr. He was the fifth of 11 children, so right in the middle of the pack. And he entered Yale College when he was just before his 13th birthday. He was only 12 years old when he started. And he held himself to very high, strict standards. He considered himself a scholar pastor, and his rule was 13 hours of study a day. His most famous sermon is the one we're going to be examining tomorrow, called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And before we look at that, it might be helpful to kind of look at the structure of a traditional Puritan sermon. It usually began with a biblical epigraph. This would be a reference to a very specific biblical passage, something from the lectionary that week, and kind of an explanation of that. And then there would be some exposition. This was demonstration of the scriptural evidence, the reasoning behind what this passage meant. And then there would be the application. This is how you were supposed to take this particular word or message and apply it to your own life or to your immediate community. And finally, in the epilogue would be the call to action. And this was usually an emotional appeal that it reminded people about why they had to do what it was that this particular biblical epigraph was encouraging them to do. And the style was what became known as fire and brimstone because of all of the constant references to what would happen if you didn't do these things. There was always this scare tactic of the hellfire that was going to open up for you, and this very strong emotional appeal. So that's the kind of thing that you would typically see if you would actually been back in time and gone to a Puritan delivery or a delivery of a Puritan style sermon. So, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God was written by Edwards and was preached on July 8th of 1741. And the text for that day was from Deuteronomy. That's the fifth book of the Bible. And it was chapter 32, verse 35. Their foot shall slide in due time. And I'll let you, as you read through the text, see if you can figure out how that applied. Some of the themes in this particular sermon were also really typical of this kind of fire and brimstone preaching. The idea of the imminence of destruction, that you are about to die, that doom is waiting for you, and that the seeds of destruction are already there, and the only thing that's holding it back at all is that just for a moment, God's holding this off from you. And this idea of the danger of death at any moment and the damnation that faces you if you're unconverted, if you haven't gotten right with God at that moment of death, which could be any second now. So here's your job. Tomorrow in class, you need to be ready to read and annotate the text. We're going to listen to it together, and you'll have a chance to mark it up. You're going to identify the soaps, and a lot of that evidence is right here in this video, but you'll see a little bit more as we read through. You're going to keep your eye out for examples of rhetorical devices. Think about how the rhetorical triangle applies here, and then analyze, how does Edwards construct his argument? What is his claim? What is the warrant that he puts forth, and what is the specific evidence and appeals that he uses? And look for those kinds of rhetorical devices and imagery as we go through. And so that's the end of this presentation. We'll see you sometime soon.